Okay. Just checking. Very well, we'll try again. JJ, if you'd edit that out, please. I'd be most gracious. So, anyway, hello and welcome. It's interesting to see so many come for what must be a bit of a niche topic. My name, as I said before, is Nial Stewart. I've lived in the Kinsale area for about 10 years, and I've been researching all kinds of historical aspects of it in that time period. I'd just like to thank the Kinsale Cultural and Heritage Society. They very kindly allowed me to give this lecture tonight. And as I did say before the mic went down, I'm going to give the lecture sitting down. One, because I'm lazy, and two, because I think it'd be actually quite nice to have a disembodied voice and let the images speak for themselves. So now you've all seen me, I'm going to sit down. Now, if anyone has been to any one of my lectures before, they'll know that I usually try and pack in as many facts as possible. This is all my attempt to try and make it as much of a resource as possible, probably to the detriment of its enjoyability. This time I said I would try to be more accessible, but I never can be. There's always too much to say in too little time. I suppose that's life. But, as you've seen, JJ is recording this talk, so please just try to get the main points of the lecture tonight, and then you can rewatch it for specifics later. Now, primarily my interest is in the 1600s, and I could easily have given a lecture on some feature of Kinsale in this period. If anyone has a suggestion for a lecture next time, you can tell me afterwards. I'll happily have a listen. It might be something I've researched, or it might be found. Anyway, whilst I was researching Kinsale in the 1600s, it brought up a large number of features that I could see had originated long before this time. I saw the final collapse of the old medieval world, and it got me to wondering about that time period in an attempt to see what had actually changed in the 1600s. But when exactly was the medieval period? Classically, it's the period from around 500 to 1500 AD. The early medieval world would be better known to us as early Christian Ireland. The high medieval period we know as the time of the Vikings, and the early part of Norman conquest. The late medieval we know as the decline of the English colony in Ireland and the start of the Tudor revival here. However, the end of the medieval in Ireland is a complicated question. It's more a question of seeing a different world personality emerge, perhaps best typified by culture and buildings. So here we have two tombstones from St Maltose, the 1627 James Galway and the 1677 Percival tombs, left and right respectively. Whilst only 50 years apart, it's clear that they're worlds apart. Now, I am a fan of medieval architecture, and when I was living in England, I was a bit of a church hound, and I went around many cathedrals and churches. And if I saw the tomb on the left, I'd instantly say medieval. No way would a tomb look like that in 1627 England, unless it was somewhere really, really rural and random. But Brown commentary there. In rural Ireland, the medieval continued later. The tomb of the Percivals on the right shows the arrival of the new era, foreign marble designs inspired by the rediscovery of the beauty of the Roman Empire. And I don't think there's a better example to be seen in Kinsale of the cultural shift which eclipsed the last days of the medieval period. So this is one of my innumerable spreadsheets. Now, there's almost nothing that's been written about medieval Kinsale, so I had to go straight to finding sources. Kinsale, like most of Ireland, has very limited source survival for the Middle Ages. Places like Dublin or Kilkenny are the type of places that are much luckier for that time period. So honestly, it wasn't really a very promising subject to start looking into. And as I say, this is my medieval Kinsale spreadsheet page, about one of 100 pages in it. And I just put it up there just as an instance of how I would record my research, just to show people, how to do it. You have chronological data on the left, you have source in the middle, and then you have the text itself on the right. And spreadsheets, they do get a bad reputation from what we do with them in offices. But when applying to something we like, I think they're fantastic. Indeed, I remember starting this very spreadsheet, and it's very off-putting when they're empty, you know. But then you start to add stuff, and themes will appear as you enter the information. This leads to other thematic spreadsheets and cross-references to show what spreadsheets the information appears in. It's hard to start, but as I say, this spreadsheet is about maybe 5 years old, and now I can actually look at it and be pleased. But any spreadsheet about the history of Kinsale will normally start with Richard Caulfield's Annals of the Corporation of Kinsale. And this is the gentleman here, another man who likes beards, so I instantly approved of him. Although mine was bigger at one stage, but this one's small. His 1878 Annals of the Corporation of Kinsale is probably the closest book we have to a written history of the town. And anytime I read his book, his style actually reminds me of my own. Include as much information as possible in an attempt to ensure the preservation of the knowledge. It doesn't read well, it doesn't listen well, but it makes a much better mind for information. Now, luckily, Caulfield's scope was very wide, and he recognised the need to transcribe historical documents, the vast majority of which by now have either disappeared or been destroyed. He transcribed several collections of Latin manuscripts, which I've translated, and these form one of the main sources that I've used for my lecture. Actually, just out of interest, I've managed to track down some of the original documents. In the 1870s, they were at Kinsale, now they're at University College London. Now, Caulfield does form a good basis for medieval studies at Kinsale, but more documents have appeared since he was studying in the 1870s, and so we can revise and add to Caulfield, all the while still being thankful for what the lovely man has done. I might add, this is an image of him when the old St Finbarr's Cathedral had been demolished in Cork, and he was busy going through the vaults. Just on the right beside his pick, you can see a rather lovely skull. So just to show you the process which both Caulfield and myself would be doing, here we have a medieval deed. So at the top, this is from the Ronin collection of manuscripts in the National Library of Ireland. At the top we have the text. So what I would do is I would photograph the text, take it back with me. Bottom left is my transcription of the Latin, and then bottom right is my translation. And just to say, if any of you ever meet me walking around the town and I look distracted or I forget to say hello, you can probably blame something like this, because this will be spinning around my head and I'll be trying to make sense of it. I'm not being rude, you can blame this. Now I'll go on to the early medieval period in Kinsale. So the earliest period of Kinsale's history is the most unknown. There's hardly anything. And what there is open to doubt. Now there's three main contenders for the origin of the town: St Maltos, the Vikings, or the McCarthys. It could be one or other or all, we just don't know. There's not enough evidence. So here we have a sculpture, late medieval, of St Maltos himself. This came from the doorway in the tower as you go into the church. There's a little niche there, which now has a rather horrible light in it. And that was uncovered in the late 19th century by one of the rectors of the church. It's now up by the communion table, as they call it. So that can be seen there. St Maltos himself is properly Hilton. You get up to the school, the graveyard, whatnot. But it's been preserved in its medieval English style as Maltos with the Anglican Church. Now the man's name was Elton, but he was given the pet name, or hypochoristic if you want to be fancy, Mo Eltoch, roughly meaning my Elton. Now Mo Eltoch gradually changed in the English-speaking mouths of the Normans and the French, also speaking mouths of the Normans and their successors. This change from Mo Eltoch into Maltos. Now, he doesn't have a biography written on him, because he's not a big saints of Ireland. His feast day, 11th December, is recorded in the Martyrology of Angus the Kildine, written sometime in the 800s, sorry. but most of the references to him start in the 1100s, hundreds of years after his death. The famous legend of the unhelpful townspeople refusing to help him build his church doesn't really help us to add to the date of the establishment of the town. However, the plan of the churchyard itself might actually be more helpful on my stand-up period. So it ties in with the shape of early Christian sites. It's this oval aspect going around. So the oval aspect would be very common to early Christian sites. How old is it? We just don't know. This cannot be proven without some kind of excavation, and that's very unlikely to happen. Was there a settlement around this church? We don't know. Why was it sited here? Yet again, we don't know. But churches always serve people, so we can assume that it was built to cater for the people who lived around it. So there's a good chance there's some embryonic settlement of Kinsale at the time. So after Maltose, our second contender for the establishment of the town are the Vikings. This is a Caulfield conjecture based on this, which is an image of the medieval seal of the town of Kinsale. Now, the town council is properly called the corporation, and so I will refer to it after. Now, this shows at the top left-hand quadrant the name of the place after Kinsale as Embleworth. And Caulfield's researchers indicated that this was a Viking name. Now, honestly, I have not done any research on Viking place names. I'll get there eventually, but I just don't know. But with the Viking establishment of Waterford in 914 and Cork the year after, it's very possible that the Vikings founded a port here, especially as they had a keen eye for a useful harbour. Apart from this, we have absolutely no other evidence for Viking Kinsale. I should say that the checkered emblem in the middle is still the arms of Kinsale centuries on. You'll see it in various permutations here and everywhere around the town. Now, the third contender for an establishment of Kinsale is as a McCarthy naval base. This may tie in with the Viking hypothesis, but we just don't know. It also ties in with the earliest piece of architecture that survives here in Kinsale, and that's the tower door in St. Maltose. It's Romanesque design, and stylistically it's been dated to around the 1130s. That's about 60 years older, 60 years earlier than the church towers in. It never photographs well. I tried many times and it just doesn't. So I invite you all to take a look on some sunny day. What you'd be looking for would be a series of well-eroded triangles. So have a look if you feel game. Now, the McCarthys, the Kings of Desmond, in the early 1100s, are recorded analytically to have had a naval base on the south coast of Cork, and the aforementioned doorway is of the same date and is comparable to doorways they built in Cronach's Chapel on the Rock at Cashel. So we have a church of architectural fashion and an analytic reference. It's only enough evidence to suggest a McCarthy naval base here, but we've nothing else to work on. And that's basically all we have on very early pre-Norman Kinsale. So now I'll talk about the rise of the town and its people, then the place itself, and the end of the era in the town. So early Anglo-Norman Kinsale. As we know, the Anglo-Normans arrived from 1169 onwards, the Kinsale era coming under their domination by the late 1100s. And by the 1200s, Kinsale would have flourished, exemplified by the building of St. Maltose as we largely know it now. Now, I'll be talking about the Anglo-Normans and the Old English. They're basically the same group of people. When the invaders arrive, we call them the Anglo-Normans. Their descendants in England and Ireland we refer to as the Old English, and this is to differentiate them from the New English who started arriving in the 1500s. The first names that are recorded are from the original wave of conquerors, the De Courcys and the De Bluns are the earliest names we have in Kinsale. De Bluns disappearing around 1300. The De Barrys, later called the Barry Oaks, had the land east of the town from the early 13th century onwards. By 1372, we have evidence of the core family of Garrettstown. They were knight tenants of the De Courcys. The Courcys were in Garrettstown until 1618, when they were replaced with the Carney family who built Garrettstown House, now rooms. Now these families all seem to have been based outside the town. The De Courcys seem to have split their time between town and their estate to the west. And these are all representatives of the lordly and knightly Anglo-Norman or Old English of the surrounding area. The colonising families of the town are a different breed, and they are the ones I want to focus on. Now, the 1200s were the period of the greatest prosperity in the early English colony, and unfortunately, good times doesn't generate much paperwork. As I say, the size of St Malto's, built in the first half of the 1200s, shows the prosperity of the place. But we have to look at the start of the troubles of the English colony before we look at the troubles of them here in Kinsale. At the start of the 14th century, we have the start of the Irish military insurgents. Then we have a famine starting in 1315. Then we have the Bruce invasion heading north but going south from 1315 to 18. And then we have the Black Death in 1348 to roughly 1350. Now, none of these events have left any evidence of local impact, but the surviving evidence shows that the colony was failing in Kinsale as well. In 1302, we have the first Muirage grant. That's a grant from the government to help build a town wall. This is not a sign of peaceful times. In 1326, the De Courcy was afraid to perform governmental duties west of the River Bandon. In 1334, the townspeople were allowed to make deals with their Irish enemies, or just make war on them without governmental approval. And then we have a bit of a lull until the 1380s, when there are more indications of the troubled state of the colony around the town. Now, with the failing state of the English colony, it starts to engage more with the surrounding Irish, and the colonists began to Gaelicize. And indeed, from the records, we can see Irish personal names start to appear in the town. Now, this process would have been quickest in rural frontier areas like Kinsale. If you're looking at other places in the colony, it happens a bit later. But I'll mention the Gaelic Irish in medieval Kinsale later. So at this point, it would actually be good to show the economic of the town as shown by windows. Who knew? Yet again, we're at St Malta's Church, which is a real treasure trove in showing the town through the century. The town mirrored the status of the English colony in Ireland. They started off defensive, then prosperity arrives, as I said, in the 1200s, and then prosperity largely departs in the mid 1300s. So our first window, bottom left, is from the tower, and it's sometime around 1190. You can see from the scale that the town is nervous, unsure. No one is getting through that bottom left window. The next window, top left, is from around the early 1200s. It's big, it's stylish, it's expensive. The town is doing well. When we do well, we show off. Not much changes. And the last window on the right is probably from the 1400s. It's got style. If you look at the top, it's got Uchi arches, but it's only on a very small scale. There's ambition in that style, but the size indicates a lack of money. Other windows in this period, in more prosperous and secure parts of the colony, would have been much larger and would feature stone mullions and transoms. And indeed, just as an aside, as windows, as a picture window into the past, if you walk around Kinsale, there's a type of window called Wyatt windows. I didn't include a picture because it's not available. But you can see them scattered around the town, and they date from the period of prosperity caused by the wars with France between the 1790s and 1815. But that's for another lecture, and just, it's interesting to see windows as vehicles into the past. So anyway, the main Old English families of the town start to appear in our surviving records around the early 1300s, and several names dominate the records. The Roaches, the Galways, and the Meads, or the Meads, seem to have been the most important in town. Then followed by the Millihonts, the still Millton's town, the Browns and the Youngs, who filled the middling rank. Then followed by the Golds, the Martells, the Ronanes, the Sarsfields, the Coppingers, and the Tyrrells. Now, all these families married and intermarried each other over the centuries and formed a small oligarchy, which was based in an odd kind of economic triangle between Kinsale, Cork, and Nial. Now, despite hundreds of years of their dominance, there are only a few visible remains of these families still to be seen. Better something than nothing. And nearly all of them are around St Malta's Church. You have Galway tombstones in the South Isle. That first rather archaic tombstone I showed you is one of them. You also have the ruined Galway chapel there. You have a Meath plaque in the chancel. You have a Roach tombstone by the Wicket Gate. And I include that because it's rather hard to find. It's intensely worn, but it shows a floreate cross. The head of the cross would be on the right. You have to go and take a look at it in good sunshine. Yet again, it's one of these things which doesn't photograph well. But kind of top middle, if you go and look at it, you can see the family coat of arms of the Roaches, but hard to spot. But their arms are easier seen if you go to the communion table in the church, as there's a bit of a ruined window there which has their arms, fish, preserved in it. Also at St Malto's, you have a brown altar tomb in the graveyard, a gold ledger stone in the church floor. The keen eye can also spot some of the coats of arms on the 1688 town charter at Kinsale Museum. As you go upstairs to the top floor, cash rise to the immediate left. It's the charter closest to the door. You'll see the arms there. Now, undoubtedly, the economic impact of these families would have influenced the street layout in the older part of town. So perhaps that's the most visible remnant that affects us in town of the medieval period. The Galways themselves are first mentioned in 1303 when they received an unspecified pardon. In medieval records, these are usually for dealings with the enemy Irish. The Galways' next few references show their importance. By 1366, they owned at least 5 townlands outside Kinsale. In 1381, they were appointed admirals for all the ports in County Cork to protect shipping. In 1382, they're ordered to help finish the construction of the town wall. The Meads, they are anglicised as Meads, but I'll keep them as Meads. The Meads are possibly first referenced in 1340 when they damaged Lemley Wood, which was the property of Tracton Abbey. But they're definitely mentioned by 1412 when a Mead is pardoned for allowing a rebel to leave Ireland. This shows that they were already in a position of authority before this date. Our first reference to Kinsale Roach is 1398, and it's a land transaction. The Martells, first possibly mentioned in 1419, but definitely by 1484, when one of them is appointed to St Malto's due to his ability to administer the sacraments in Irish, and I'll come back to that later. For the Belfonts, our first reference is 1541, a land transaction, but undoubtedly they were here long before that. A law of 1487 is the earliest young reference. The Browns have the prize for the earliest reference, which is 1297, but unfortunately the records go no further, they give no details. Coppingers first appear in 1474, when the papal court intervened to appoint a vicar, St Malto's. The right of presentation of the church had been in the control of Bath Abbey in Somerset since at least the 1290s. The Golds appear first in the early 1600s, but they surely must begin much earlier as part of the network of mercantile families between Cork and St. Nial. Romains mentioned first, 1487 in that law of the oath, and the Terrys get a mention in 1516 as merchants. Now, the records for all these families, like most medieval things, are very, very scanty. But we do have a list of prominent citizens recorded in that 1487 oath of loyalty, the first Tudor monarch, Henry VII. It lists most of the important families of Kinsale, with the odd exception of Meath, but it also provides unique references for families who were obviously of importance at the time, but left no subsequent mention in the records. Butler, Gowl, which still look at that, Wynne, Dinwees, Bled, Sen, a Power, which I think is Welsh, Gernan and Gale. Of these families, I know nothing further. But then what of the Gaelic Irish? Was the town a homogeneous Old English society, the Gaelic Irish being kept out? As usual, it's difficult to examine the situation with so few documents surviving, but we have some. So, my other microphone has come out. JJ, I might get to reattach it once I do this. So, on the right hand side, at the top, I have highlighted some Irish names: Ginan, Donald, O'Hegarty, Coolius, and this is a deed of lease from 1475. And so it shows that they're well ensconced in the town. They're making land deals, they're having them recorded. The Irish are within the walls. Sometimes people think that there was no Irish influence in town, but we have this and many other deeds to show that there was. So I wonder, is this comparable to a later situation where some of the Irish would have been against English government, some actively supporting it, but was it just a case of most people just wanting to live their lives? I don't know, it's a thought. We just don't have enough information. All we can say is they were there and they were interacting. Now that 1484 reference to the sacramental need for the Irish language and church is further evidence of a strong Irish, and potentially monoglot at that, presence in the town. There's also a reference from the very late medieval period stating that the merchants are Irish, when the merchants of Kinsale could speak Irish. And indeed, in this instance, we have some Tan O'Hegarty and Margaret U. Galway. Now, I suspect this is one of the several instances. There's a transliteration error somewhere, but I suspect the lady was actually Margaret Neath Galway, as in the Irish daughter of. So that's yet again, this is another instance of the integration of the two cultures, as I say, 1475. Now, I'll just put up an extract from the famous visit of Archduke Ferdinand to Kinsale. This discusses the dress of the townspeople, just to give you a visual, and it also mentions the Irish who were unfriendly who lived nearby. You probably can't all read it, so I shall read it. Stand up again. Firstly, married women wear their finery and linen head coverings, some yellow and others white. When they are women of status, they have chemises with long sleeves opened around the neck, and in the seams, silk needlework of different colours. Many of them had their hair cropped in front and back, except for two tresses of hair by the side, which are a yard long. They plait these like children here, making hats and rushes, and then secure them so they do not come undone. And with the tops of their heads so adorned, these loops of hair braided accordingly hang down in front, more or less to their waists, in such way that these women can clip them on to the ends of their headdress, which they have decorated with tassels. These women have skirts or petticoats patterned with holes, as was the fashion in the past, and over their chests they have raised circlets to support the bust. Actually, there's a lot of breasts which I haven't included, but this is online, you can look it up later. And above their dresses, they wear white clothes and big belts decorated with beautiful buckles, some of gilded silver, also copper, metal, or brass, according to their rank. Their dresses had wide sleeves, open the length of their arms, interlaced very nicely in a lattice. Generally, the men, women, and young girls wear their shirts open to the waist, without any distinction between them, except the women's chemises, as they are over here, are wide below, tapering into four tails which hit the knees, as the case may be. The women and girls there wear coloured shoes of red and green, and others they like better bound and held on by garters, unlike those in Castile. They wear little sandals with single soles, very pretty, and cute fine work on top with another colour of leather, and sometimes adorned with dyed leather as if they were gold, like the shoes which were bought for children at fairs in times past. Having heard about the rig out of the women and girls, listen how the men are kicked out. For sure, even more strangely than the women, and particularly the rural people and the savages being native Irish, for they were shorn and shaved one pan above the ears, so that only the tops of their heads were covered with hair. But on the forehead they leave about a pan of hair to grow down to their eyebrows, like a tuft of hair which one leaves hanging on horses between the two eyes. They are strangely bearded. Here's again. Some shave their beards just above the mouth, and others go below the mouth. Others shave some places, and then their beards grow to tufts. These men have their shirts open down to the belt, and without sleeves, so they have bare arms. They wrap themselves in a big linen cloth, which goes around them 1.5 times, and stretches nearly from neck to foot. And they have bare feet and bare legs. Sounds rather nice to me. And then speaking of the rurals, at certain times of the year, these savages and rural people never failed to come in great number to ravage the town and inhabitants of Kinsale, and then times past would pillage everything and kill all who opposed them. But now the townsfolk have found a way to greet them happily and to feast with them and to give them good food and drink, and then leave, taking them a small souvenir, but against their arrival they hide the good effects for fear of losing them. You see published that all online, and it's well worth a read. So, getting back to the narrative, from the mid 1500s, we have more records surviving, largely as a result of the resurgent English interest in Ireland. Once they forget about France at long last, they then start to look at us again. So, we have a semi reasonable documented span of roughly 100 years before the my putative end of the medieval period. Kinsale seems to have never fallen from direct governmental control, but the importance of the town apparently waned enough that government intervention largely fell off from about 1412. This left the mercantile families in town, the aforementioned, the potential to assume control of the town, dominating it both politically and economically. The families engaged in trade, and there was great scope for profits, especially when compared to the relative prosperity of Ireland in general. These families then reinvested their trade profits in buying land around the town. Now, the land that these families owned ranged as far north as Ballinhassig, as far west as Garrettstown, and as far east as Roberts Cove. They did have some property further afield, but I'm not going to speak of that. So using various sources, I collated the land ownings of the families as they stood sometime later in 1641. So the Roaches outranged all the other families by a huge measure, owning 8,765 acres. And when I'm discussing the medieval report, you'll see that the Roaches were the main trading family in the town, and thus we can see how they came to such a huge estate. None of the other families get such a huge acreage. The Galways, 1,543 acres, the Youngs, 1,149, the Meads, 1,148, the Milhonts, 730, and the Browns, 325. So you can see the Roaches fairly outpaced them. Now, at this point, I'd like to try and show some of the physical features of medieval Kinsale, just to show where things were and what went on with them. And yet again, this is my attempt to bring medieval Kinsale out of its relatively dark obscurity. I should thank my good friend Kim Walsh, who's in the audience, for helping with all these images, and especially with this map. Now, the dotted line is roughly the area that's been reclaimed in the 1700s from the harbour. I've left a bit of a blank just around here, as I tend to get a bit confused there. Appropriately enough, it's around the Greyhound where I usually get confused for other reasons. But it all disregards where the wall met the water and how far it had been reclaimed in. It's difficult to tell from the maps, so I've deliberately left that a bit unfilled, even though it doesn't look that good. So first of all, St Maltos, that is the light blue, just here. Now, I've dealt with St Maltos by talks in the church. I mentioned in articles in the record, so further details can be found there. But I'll briefly describe the medieval fabric of the church. The tower itself dated around 1190, and if you look at it, it looks like a castle tower, and it only has very small windows accordingly. It's defensible, and it nods towards the frontier nature of the town. The main body of the church dates from sometime in the first half of the 1200s, I'd say. The windows, the big windows I showed earlier, are all in the early English Gothic style, and their number and the size of the church shows the prosperity of the town. The windows, the walls, the font, the piscina, that's a wall niche where the holy vessels were washed originally, that's up at the communion table. And several tombs. These are the medieval survivals of the church. Another old feature of the church was that the rites aforementioned to nominate the clergy were actually held by the Abbey of Bath in England. Note the connection to southwest England, as that was Kinsale's main trading partner. How did they get them? Probably at the Lord's request in his last will and testament. Now, I should add that St Maltos is one of the biggest medieval parish churches in Ireland. The others would be New Ross, Youghal, Galway. So next, the ferry down here. First mentioned 1321, but undoubtedly established much earlier and active up until the 20th century. Some here probably used it. Next, crossing up the river was in the Shannon. So this would have been a profitable enterprise and was owned by the de Courcys. The de Courcys sold the ferry to the good-going Roaches in 1554, and this is another good example of the merchants of town buying businesses and the lands around it. Being a ferry, it's left no physical remains, and I've just positioned it here because over the centuries, its starting point of town has tended to jump around a bit. Now, the walls of Kinsale are the orange line, done quite roughly, well enough based. And this is one of the areas where I would actually add Caulfield. So Caulfield states that they were begun in 1381, but I've actually managed to push that date back. There's a grant to repair them in 1348. There's a reference to them being ruinous in 1334. And finally, there's a grant to build the walls as far back as 1302. There are portions that survive close enough to the modern Carmel Priory, but none to full height. They would have resembled the section of town walls that survives in Youghal, battlemented with towers, with gatehouses, and they are recorded as having a walkway large enough for two men to walk abreast. If you look at any of the numerous depictions of the siege and battle of Kinsale 601, you can see all these features. Supposedly demolished in 1690, but I find many references to their repair in the early 1700s. But they seem to have been pulled down piecemeal in the late 1700s. The various gatehouses pulled down between 1790 and the last one in 1811. One of the debates surrounding the walls is whether or not they went on the seafront. From the sources, I'd say no. like the initial map we had on my title page, but that would be a future argument and not for now. So next would be the castles of Kinsale. These would be the red dots. Now, when we think medieval, we think castles. It's the classic image. What do we see? Big walls, towers, gatehouse, moats. Now, you'll say that Kinsale never had a castle. Kinsale Castle, never heard of it? And you'd be right, according to the image just mentioned in your head. The closest that Kinsale had to our Hollywood image would have been Curran Castle, where Charleston is now. And it would have looked, this is Carol, but this is an aerial view of what Curran Castle would have been similar to. Built by the Barry family, later known as the Barry Oaks, that's small Barrys as opposed to the big Barrys, the Barrymores of East and North Cork. Built sometime in the 1200s or 1300s, we know very little about it from the records. But in the maps of the siege and battle, we can see what form it took. A so-called keepless castle, curtain walls, strong towers, domestic buildings would fit within. It was ruined after the siege in 1601, modified in the late 1660s, and finally demolished for the building of Charles Fort in 1677. So back to the castles of Kinsale, this is the type of thing we're thinking of. An urban tower house, but known in the records as castles. And Desmond Castle was our only surviving example in the town. I discovered around 10 more that have disappeared. There's a lot of debate on when tower houses emerged as a feature, but the usual span of the building is 1400s to the early to mid 1600s. Desmond Castle itself reckoned to be about 1500, but it's unusual in a number of ways. Firstly, it was not built by one of the traditional Old English merchant families in town. It was built by the Earl of Desmond to protect his newly granted rights to certain import customs from the harbour, wine in this case. It was a jail in the 1700s, 1800s, and after that it was an undertaker's parlour. And then with the OBW restoration, it's a bit of an architectural jumble and wouldn't be good as a typical guide to an urban tower house. Now, from the later records from the 1600s, it appears that the Kinsale merchant families usually had something like this. They had an urban tower house, and then they had a substantial house close by. Why the two? The tower house seems to have not only a defensive purpose, but was also the storage of their merchandise. Their big house nearby for living and conspicuous consumption. Indeed, Desmond Castle had its corresponding big house nearby called Earl Court, but it's completely vanished. The coat of arms up top is there, the coat of arms, the medieval coat of arms of the Kingdom of England and France. And the lower coat of arms are those of the Fitzgerald family, the Earls of Desmond. The bottom windows with their bars are from the time of the building as a prison. So rather randomly, this is a representation from about 1560 of Carrickfergus in County Antrim, my neck of the woods. It's obviously not Kinsale, but this is probably the best depiction I've ever seen of what a late medieval Anglo-Norman port in Ireland would have looked like. So if you note the mix of tower houses, once they Kinsale has many, I'm not sure which is more. You have good masonry buildings lining the streets. You have the cabins at the back roads. You have the medieval parish church, that's St. Nicholas. Up top, which I'm not tall enough for, is the primary. And then you have the town walls also shown. But you also have a good section of open space. And from the various records in Kinsale, it's surprising just how much open space there was in town. So I'll just go back to my map. I know I'm getting on a bit, so I will skim. So castle-wise, we have Desmond Castle. We have the Young Family Castle, which now occupies the very floor plan of Lasnik. This was possibly known as Schiller's Castle in the late 1600s, or Schiller's Castle was another tower house close by. We have the DeCourcy Castle up on the ramparts. We have either one or two tower houses on Friar Street. One of these is known as Darley Castle. We have the Melfont, tall. We have the Melfont Tower House, very close to where Little is now. We have the Galway family castle in Blackhorse Field, too far off the map to be shown. That is up the Bandon Road. We have the Cornish Castle on Lower Collins Street. We have John Young Fitzwilliam's Castle on Harrow Collins Street. And then we have two unidentified ones, which are unplaced rather, which I haven't been able to find the street for. Carney's Castle and Cole's Castle. This is the total so far, but there may well be more tower houses which I just haven't discovered. Indeed, there are also several outside the town, like Shippool, formerly known as Pool Along, and that's the one that Joe found it for, that's 1543, and then again built with the roaches. Fishery and Port. Another subject hardly mentioned in the legal sources. It could be written, but as the Irish records are gone, it would have to be recreated by looking at the port books of Kinsale's trading partners. And this would mean I'd have to go to many archives in England, France, Spain, and further afield. A study has been made of the Bristol port books, picking 12 random years from the 1500s and examining trade with Ireland. I'll skip this because I see we're getting on time-wise. Kinsale is exporting raw materials, fish, farming products, and it's importing luxury goods, manufactured goods. Just in that 12-year period, it records 41 cargoes coming into town, 34 of the roaches, the small reindeers to the other families. But as I said, the roaches were the most successful family in town. Extreme top right is towards the Level House. That was just to the south of Brown's Mills. Medieval Ireland seemed to have had a lot of skin diseases. Level House wasn't just for leprosy. First mentioned 1306, last mentioned 1531. I suspect the Reformation destroyed that. Its existence is preserved in the small townland of Spitalfield. Streets, the lines. As I said, probably the greatest survivor of medieval Kinsale. These narrow streets. Anytime you're stuck in traffic in town, you can thank the medieval period for the narrow streets. Streets have been added, the harbour has been partially filled in, but for the innards of town, it's largely the same street pattern. Lower Hull Street, known as Fisher Street until 1966. Fisher Street as far back as 1481. It's not named after someone called Fisher, it's known after the fishermen. In the Latin, it's known as Vigo Piscatorum, the Street of the Fishermen. The road running past St Maltose was known as the Gassing, and the most referenced street in the records is someone called Stratton Dornoch, and I suspect this is Main Street in Gardwell, but I haven't proved it yet. Strad, could be from Irish Street, Street of Dornoch, I don't know. I'm no expert in this language of the time, but leave with me. Hog Street, known as that as far back as 1525, Friar Street as 1513. The market doesn't really get much of a mention in the records. That's the purple dot stretching as far as the courthouse to where in front of Cozy Cafe is now. There was a market cross, which is where the flower bed is in the middle of the road outside the Cozy Cafe. It's seen on the maps of 1601, but vanishes by 1700. We could blame Cromwell, but we just don't know, so I'll be nice for a change. Up top is the prison. That is the green circle. That was the Maiden's prison, one of the turrets of town, and that would be used for imprisoning The Friary, our last feature. Carmelite Friary of the Blessed Virgin Mary, founded in 1734. This was the last Carmelite foundation in Ireland for the Black Death, and it's probably our last burst of prosperity in Ireland, in Kinsale, before it enters a long slump. Founded 1334, re-endowed 1350. There's a good number of references to it, I'm skimming here, to the 1400s and 1500s, showing that the prior was involved in economic life in town. Of the few priors whose names we have, none are of Irish extraction, they're all Anglo-Normans. At the dissolution of the monastery in 1541, it's described as church, belfry, cloister, hall, and other buildings, and a graveyard of under 3 stangs, which is just under 2 acres. It has property in town amounting to a house, 6 gardens, and 6.5 acres, again showing us just how much of the town is unbuilt on. A will of 1557 leaves it a donation. Probably it's refounded under the reign of the English Catholic Queen Mary, Queen 1553 to 1558. But every mention to it after 1567 refers to it as site of, so the monks have stopped using it. Heavily battered in the siege of 1601 from one of the English positions, some Carmelite use in the 1600s. The remains now, there's 2 ranges left, but there's no real architectural features. The only thing is what a little wooden sign there refers to as a well, but to my eye it looks more like a holy water stoop. You go in, I use the correct hand, you go in and you bless yourself and all with a stoop. So now is the end of the medieval period. JJ, do you have time? Okay, I get, no? Okay, well this won't take long. Double time for me, yeah. So the end of medieval Kinsale. So, and this is a short bit on the page. The religious Reformation, 1530s onwards, introduced an entirely new dynamic to Irish history, and the old English adherents to Catholicism eventually sealed their doom. 2 events started a serious decline of the relationship between them and the Protestant English government. Papal excommunication of Elizabeth I in 1570, and soon after the First Desmond Rebellion. Now, whilst most of the Catholic Old English remained loyal, these were the first events that linked Irish Catholicism to rebellion in the minds of the English government. Despite the protestations of loyalty from the Old English, they came to be as distrusted as the Gaelic Irish, much to their great annoyance. In the late 1500s, there was a significant colonisation of Ireland by a further wave of English settlers. These we call the New English, to distinguish them from the Old English. Protestant, not Catholic, untouched by Gaelic culture, and distrustful towards the inhabitants, be they Gaelic Irish or Old English. And once they were enough in number, they offered an alternative to governmental reliance on the Old English, and the government slowly took that alternative. In the Kinsale area, we've got several indications of the wariness of the government. Several of the old English families in the town had been pardoned in the 1570s and 80s for dealing with the rebels. International trade also gave suspicious links to the continent, being in contact with the trend of Reformation. The siege and battle of 1601 also gave concern to the government. Had the Old English of Kinsale sided with the battle? The corporation, quote, Kinsale fell to the Spaniards due to the weakness of the place and their small defence, not through their disloyalty, end quote. The government still had the doubts and confiscated the town charter in 1603, only restoring it in 1609. And I say we're running over time, so all I'll say is for the early 1600s, the Old English were less and less relied upon by the English government. And under pressure from the Stewart government, they tried to appear loyal. They tried to appear loyal, but they just couldn't manage it. You know, they could not square their Catholicism with the new government's Protestantism. So by the time Cromwell comes around, all political power had been taken from the medieval families of Kinsale, and most of the properties were confiscated as well. The fashionable tomb of the Percivals and Southalls that I showed at the start is a good example of the new era. Robert Southall in 1663 received several thousand acres of the confiscated lands of medieval families, and with the confiscation of the medieval families' lands, so the medieval period finally closed in Kinsale. The last thing I'll do is this. This is a bit of an appeal. I just like to publicise the charity walk I was doing, the suicide prevention Douglas's Light Walk. I'm doing it for a friend, and I'd be grateful for donations. You can either type my name in or scan the QR code. So, ladies and gentlemen, it only remains to thank you for your very patient attention, and to thank my friend Kim Walsh, and to thank the Kinsale Cultural and Heritage Society. As I say, it's going to be the morning to a wonderful man.
Just we have a couple of questions, I know. So is there anybody just before